Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Book Sandwiched In for January 30th. It's a beautiful day in Beaufort. And after the cold weather we've had over the last couple of days, hopefully that's our winter. And it's about 60 degrees right now. But first we want to hear from Marilyn Harris before we go enjoy that beautiful weather. And we'll hear that shortly. But I just want to welcome everybody to this 35th anniversary edition of Book Sandwiched In. It's put on by the Friends of the Beaufort Library, and Donna Armour and Karen Warner are our co-chairs, and I think you met Karen already. And the Friends of the Library support libraries in Northern Beaufort County and in Lubico, in the city of Beaufort, and also on St. Helena Island. So just want to make a few announcements before we actually get started and maybe talk a little bit about the format. Those of you that may not be familiar with how Book Sandwich in BSI or Book Sandwiched In works is we try to get a prominent individual to discuss a book that many book clubs are reading or might have been on some of the bestseller lists in the New York Times and elsewhere. And we try to pick this prominent person from the local area here in Beaufort County and in the city of Beaufort. And this is strictly an hour show. It's from 12 to 1. And again, hence the name, Book Sandwich In during the lunch hour. So, and we've got a number of folks. You've got the schedule, or many of you have gotten the schedule, but just to make you aware of some changes over the next few weeks. On February 7th, we had Rebecca Bruff, who is going to discuss Trouble the Water. She's the author of that book, and she had to withdraw for personal issues. But in place of Rebecca, Karen Warner is going to discuss her book, The Sudden Caregiver, and that's next week. That's February 7th. And she was originally scheduled for February 21st. And on February 21st, we have Jonathan Haupt, who's the executive director of the Pat Conroy Center. He's going to discuss The Water is Wide, Pat Conroy's book. The Water is Wide. It's the 50th anniversary of that book. And Jonathan agreed to step in and help us out with that. And I'm sure you'll enjoy that. Another issue that I think is important to mention, in fact, very important to mention, is that on February 7th, compliments of Donna Armour and all the hard work she's done as co-chair. She's developed a silent auction site, as you know, or many of you know, in the live broadcasts when we've done this at the University of South Carolina. In Beaufort here, we've had raffle items from the various businesses around town, various organizations, again, which are used to support the libraries here in Northern Beaufort County. Since we are strictly an online format, really through the end of the programs, we have, and through Donna and Karen, have put together a silent auction site with many of these prizes, and it will be live on February 7th. So again, we urge you to go there, support the library, support some local businesses, take a look at the items. I think you'll find some pretty good prizes there. And, again, because of the pandemic, we had to move to the online format. So this auction site hopefully will alleviate some of the issues of not doing it live. So go ahead and hit that site when it's live on February 7th. And it'll be up till March 6th, I believe. So you'll have about 30 days to take a look at the items there and submit your bids. So please go ahead and do that. So with that being said, it's time to get to our speaker for today, Marilyn Harris, and she's going to be introduced by Victoria Smalls. Many of you know Victoria, and Victoria has a long and distinguished career. And she's a St. Helena native. She's a preservationist, a historian, an educator. She worked for the National Park Service as a park ranger, and she's a very strong advocate for the Gullah Geechee heritage community. And she's now the newly appointed executive director of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor National Heritage Area, and her office is in downtown Beaufort, and right near right across the street from the library and National Park Service. And Victoria will introduce our speaker for today. Victoria, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jean. I so appreciate you. It's such a pleasure to be here, beautiful Beaufort, South Carolina. So let me get started. So who do you think you are, and where do you think you are going, Marilyn Harris? Well, I believe Marilyn is a phenomenal woman, and her journey is still being paved. I have the privilege of introducing you all to her. Scores of who have attended the empowering workshops of Marilyn Harris have learned that finding the answer to those questions of who do you think you are and where do you think you are going reveals the confidence and self-esteem that are vital to success. Harris was always a believer in dreaming the impossible dream. Growing up and nurtured in a small Virginia town, she was an insatiable reader whose imagination knew no limits, One whose story inspired her was Althea Gibson, the first Black athlete to cross the color line of international tennis when she won the French Open in 1956, and who the next year became the first Black woman Wimbledon champion. Gibson's book, I Always Wanted to Be Somebody, motivated Harris to work hard and overcome any obstacles to accomplishing her dreams. In her workshops, Harris motivates participants to use the power of their own thoughts, words, and dreams to reach high and push beyond levels they once thought themselves incapable of attaining. She encourages strength through authoritative, I am, self-validating statements, and by identifying and eliminating self-eliminating negativity. Empowering, moving, and outstanding are just a few of the comments participants have made in describing their experiences at her life-changing workshops and sessions. A South Carolina transplant, or as we Gullah Geechee folks say, a kumya. Ms. Harris retired after nearly 35 years of public service in senior positions in the Pentagon, the Department of Veteran Affairs, and in the United States House of Representatives as a permanent staff with the House Appropriations Committee. This is truly impressive. Reading Marilyn's abbreviated bio prompts me to share a few words from our beloved Maya Angelou, and I quote, "Now you understand just why my head's not bowed. I don't shout or jump about or have to talk loud. When you see me passing, it ought to make you proud, because I am a woman phenomenal woman, that's me. So who do I think Marilyn Harris is? She's a phenomenal woman. Quickly, I'd like to take executive director privilege and take a few seconds to share a little bit about my people, the Gullah Geechee people. We are proud descendants of Africans who were enslaved on rice, indigo, and Sea Island cotton plantations of the lower Atlantic coast. And many of our ancestors came from rice-growing regions of West Africa. The very nature of their enslavement on isolated islands and coastal sites of enslavement created a unique culture with deep African retentions that are clearly visible in our distinctive arts, crafts, music, language, and yes, our foodways. Please continue to listen in as my friend Marilyn shares and compels you to read High on the Hog, A Culinary Journey from Africa to America by Dr. Jessica B. Harris. So it is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce you to a phenomenal woman, Miss Marilyn Harris.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, now you know why I wanted Victoria Smalls to be a part of this. High on the Hog is all about everything that Victoria is all about, even before she assumed this amazing position. And so thank you. And I look forward to connecting you to all the things that she just described about the Low Country in Gullah Geechee. Thank you to the Friends of the Library for inviting me to present this book and for this opportunity. I'm excited and honored to be a part of the 2022 book Sandwiched In. So let's get to it. High on the Hog, A Culinary Journey from Africa to America. This book, the first thing I want to say to you about this book is that it's being translated into a 4-episode, or actually has been translated into a 4-episode Netflix docuseries that I learned today has been recently renewed for another season. So I encourage you to watch it, but know that it cannot include everything that's in this book. So if you can only do one, do the book. I have read the book, I have listened to the book on Audible, and then I've read the book again and I've watched the Netflix series. I'm not saying you have to do all of those things, but do at least 2 of them. I will also tell you that the book is narrated on Audible by Jessica B. Harris herself, who's quite fluent in French. I will go ahead and offer a disclosure right now, I'm not. And so if I butcher some French words, you're just gonna have to listen to Jessica pronounce them correctly, but I'll do my best. What inspired me to read this book? Well, actually, exactly what inspired one of the producers to read this book. A friend read it. Daisy White called me and said, you have got to read this book. It's life-changing. And since I always do what Daisy White tells me to do, I read the book. So that same friend, Daisy, introduced me telephonically to Dr. Harris because, and I discovered that both women are equally as amazing. It was just wonderful to have a brief interaction with Dr. Harris. And this happened before I actually finished reading the book. So I wanted to call her back and have a do-over, but I decided that wouldn't be the coolest thing I could do. So in 1985, Jessica Harris wrote her first cookbook called Hot Stuff, a cookbook in praise of the piquant. And to quote her, she says, here in the US, the African culinary tradition has not yet been thoroughly explored, but the indigenous cooking of Black Americans has preserved its soul. In 2011, she did that herself. And she dedicated High on the Hog to the ancestors who slaved and to the African-American cooks and culinary entrepreneurs. What is High on the Hog? In a sentence, it's a culinary journey from Africa to the Americas. It is a history of African-Americans told through the lens of food. In her foreword, ironically, Maya Angelou wrote that Harris has left little room for argument about her findings. If I had one challenge with this book, it would be that it is so much. There is so much in this book. I loved every bit of it. Otherwise, I couldn't have read it that many times or listened to it. But there's so much. And the challenge is to the way that she weaves the hard stuff, and she weaves together the hard stuff and the joy. And so there's hard stuff in the book, yes, but there's also joy in the book. And the joy that she presents is presented through participants. Jessica Harris is the author of 15 books, mostly cookbooks. In 2010, she was a special award honoree from the James Beard Foundation. In 2017, she published a memoir, My Soul Looks Back. In 2020, she won a James Beard Foundation Award for Lifetime Achievement. And in her acceptance speech, she noted that she was cooking when cooking wasn't cool. In 2021, she appeared in Time's annual 100 Most Influential People. And in May of 2021, Netflix released a 4-episode series called High on the Hog, How African-American Cuisine Transformed America, which is based entirely on this book. She is a graduate of Bryn Mawr, where she spent her junior year studying in Paris. She's an only child. She grew up in Queens, New York, and visited frequently at her parents' home on Martha's Vineyards. But after graduation, she went back to Paris to study for another year and returned to New York to earn a master's degree at Queens College and a PhD from NYU. She has been a journalist, a food editor, a book review editor at Essence Magazine, and a theater critic. But her travels to West Africa to work on her doctoral dissertation may actually have been the beginning of this journey. So why are we talking about a book that was released in 2011? Because it is experiencing a revival as a result of the Netflix series, actually. The series, in my view, is timely in that it brings us together by demonstrating what we have in common. Some things have definitely changed since it was published. There are more new Black chefs who've been recognized by the James Beard Foundation and others who are finding their places in the culinary world. One of those chefs is our very own, and I call her our own because she's so close to us in Savannah. And that is Chef Bailey of Savannah, a James Beard winner who opened a highly acclaimed restaurant called The Gray. And if you haven't been to The Gray, I think you should go. That's just my opinion. One of the central themes of the book is to familiarize the reader with how our shared collective history influences our cuisine and our thinking about what and how we see each other. She does an amazing job of infusing the historical African-American cuisine with new cuisine. She studied in France, as did a couple of the participants in this book that you'll hear about in a couple of minutes. But I just want to share a little bit about how the menu is structured, because it is exactly what Jessica Harris wants to see us do, wants to see how she wants us to move beyond our traditional view of soul food and to expand it somewhat. So when you go to The Gray, you'll see that the menu is divided into 4 parts, and you have to select from each of those parts. One is called Dirt. And under this heading and under all of the headings, you'll actually see traditional African-American fare. You'll see fare that's based on local cuisine, some of it Gullah Geechee cuisine. So from Dirt, you could choose on this particular day, beets with whipped feta, arugula, and pecans. But you could also order sweet potato, but it comes with quinoa and buttermilk and pickled watermelon rind. And then you pick from water on the menu, and you have a choice of tuna salad, Midland, what she calls Midland, which is Carolina gold rice, ruby red shrimp, and tarragon. She's mixing the old with the new. Under pasture, you can select sweetbread or quail that's prepared with country ham gravy, kale, and mashed potato, or crepinette, which is prepared with parsnip, turnips, pickled mustard and seed. And then you move to the pantry, where you'll find rabbit mortadella, smoked carrot, and duck confit. In the introduction to the Netflix series, Jessica Harris says she wants you to leave hungry. And she wants you to leave hungry for food, and she wants you to leave hungry for more knowledge. I hope that brief introduction to the Gray makes you a little bit hungry for food right here at noontime. So speaking about how she introduced the Netflix series, I would say that she challenges the notion that Black chefs can only cook certain types of food, also known as soul food or new soul food. And she wants to dispel the myths that keep Black chefs from the opportunities that they deserve. She wants us to know that we are more alike than we are different, even in the way we consume food. So in this introduction, if you were to watch it, you will see and hear how this book represents Harris's life work. She speaks of tasting things all over the world and realizing that the tastes were familiar. They tasted like home, and she thought that needed to be explored. According to Harris, food is the language in which we talk to each other, and everyone is talking about food. Food is comforting, food is celebrating, food is essential to life. And when we lose our sense of taste, we lose something that's very important to our quality of life. So regarding soul food, she wants you to know that she sees the term as somewhat limiting when you think about it in terms of African-American cuisine, because it's regional, like the continent of Africa is regional. She reminds us that every culture has food that comforts the soul. And I can tell you this from experience. I came here from Virginia, and in Virginia, we had Black eyed peas just like you do here, but we didn't have Hoppin' John. I didn't have Hoppin' John in Virginia. We did have Black eyed peas at New Year's because it was lucky, but we had it with stewed tomatoes. And when I say that to my friends here, they go, yuck. So Black eyed peas and stewed tomatoes. So it's for me, that was soul food. It's about how you feel when you eat it, any type of cuisine. But Africa is so much a part of American food that we don't even think about it. We know that food is foundational to cooking in this country. And when I use the term we, I am referring to we African Americans. So it's obvious to you that I am African American, I think. So think about the role that African Americans occupied during enslavement. They were growing the food, harvesting the food, processing the food, preparing the food, and serving the food. Harris says that Black hands were always in the food. The book is essential in helping to realize how much learning and unlearning there is to do. For example, at the beginning of the 1700s, some people don't know that at the beginning of the 1700s, there were more Blacks in South Carolina than in any other colony. Foundational wealth of this country, of this nation, was created from rice that originated in West Africa. That our captivity and enslavement to grow that industry wasn't just our physical bodies or our stature, but actually for our intellectual capabilities, our intellectual technology as farmers that made our labor so coveted. So the book and the Netflix series explain how food connects us through time, across geography, and through generations. It seeks to tell the stories about where we have been, where we are, and even where we're going. It tells a story of resilience, ingenuity, and strength from the earliest days through the darkest days of struggles, how we persevered, and as the old folks say, how we got over. And that doesn't mean got over on you, but how we made it over. So now that I've introduced Jessica Harris, I want, allow me to have Jessica Harris introduce the book from the introduction of her book. So in her words, I've spent more than 3 decades writing about food, about the food of African Americans and how it connects with other cuisines in the hemisphere and around the world. And so I also know that the food of the African continent and its American diaspora continues to remain a culinary art unknown for most folks. The history of African Americans in this country is a lengthy one that begins virtually at the time of exploration. Our often hyphenated name in all its complexity hints at the intricate mixings of our past. We are a race that never before existed, a cobbled together admixture of Africa, Europe, and the Americas. We are like no others before us or after us. Involuntarily taken from a homeland, molded in the crucible of enslavement, foraged in the fire of disenfranchisement, and tempered by migration, we all too often remain strangers in the only land that is ours. Despite all this, she writes, we have created a culinary tradition that has marked the food of this country more than any other. Our culinary history is fraught with all the associations with slavery, race, and class that the United States has to offer. For this reason, the traditional foodways that derive from the history of enslavement that many of us share are often perceived as unhealthy, inelegant, and hopelessly out of sync with the culinary canons that define healthy eating today. And I would say at this point that Chef Bailey, by her very existence and the existence of her restaurant, defies that description. Yet for centuries, Harris writes, Black hands have tended pots, fed babies, and worked in the kitchens of this country's wealthiest and healthiest. She's in describing what she attempts to do in the book, she writes, I will speak of scant meals of hog and hominy and of simple folk who became culinary entrepreneurs like illiterate Pigfoot Mary, who created a real estate empire from the food that she cooked on an improvised stove on the back of a baby carriage. She writes of presidential chefs like George Washington's Hercules and Thomas Jefferson's James Hemings, and of an alternate African-American culinary thread that weaves through the fabric of our food. This parallel thread is a strong one and includes big house cooks who prepared lavish banquets, caterers who created culinary cooperatives in Philadelphia in the 19th century, and a legion of Black hoteliers and culinary moguls. She believes that fate has placed her at the junction of the two Black culinary traditions, that of the big house and that of the rural South, because of her own ancestry. And so the book is divided into 3 parts. Each chapter in the book rather is divided into 3 parts. An introduction that sets the stage for the book and presents a personal and present day look at each of the stops on this journey. The main section of each chapter begins with a chronological presentation of the African-American history of the period that's discussed. And then finally, each chapter ends with a coda that adds a closer look at some aspects of the period's food. Harris begins at the beginning, before the middle passage, and she takes the time in the first several chapters to describe the people who were captured and enslaved. And she describes them as they were before. She presents them through the records of explorers, travelers, and traders, and used those traders and explorers' words to describe the governments of the African governments and communities, their lives, their habits, their rituals, and their ceremonies. She writes about the lavishness of the kingdoms, of the beauty of the land, and of the lushness of the crops, and how they planted, harvested, prepared, and cooked their food. And I just want to share with you something that was written in 1352 about an early explorer's experience. This explorer wrote of how he found crops like tomatoes and corn and chilies and peanuts on the African continent. And he talks about how, about not only about the ingredients in the storage vessels, but also about the cooking techniques, about a woman-driven marketplace and a tradition of warm hospitality and the importance of food in rituals. And this particular traveler or explorer talks about rice dishes and corn puddings and the fact that there were a wide variety of vegetables, fowl that was abundant. But he also talks about how the food was so rich, and this is a quote, "The dish is a rich dish if eaten with rice and pilau, that a Frenchman could serve this dish in the most aristocratic gastronomes of France." He talks about how welcoming and hospitable the Africans were, how they extended their arms, and even in the courts of the kings and queens, they were welcomed and treated warmly. He talks about how a meal that he sat down to that had 88 different dishes. And as you read through the book and you read how plantations services were done, you'll note that this would not have been foreign to some of the enslaved people from Africa, who were brought here from Africa. So she begins at the beginning before the Middle Passage. And she does this to humanize the people who eventually became enslaved African American. And as I said, reading the details of some of these ceremonies, such as the one with the 88 different dishes that were presented in opulent serveware, I could make the connection between what they lost and what they witnessed as enslaved people living in the plantations and serving in the big houses. Harris calls okra, watermelon, and black-eyed peas Africa's gift to the New World. And she explains the origins of each, but also laments the way that the association of these are how the okra, the watermelon, and black-eyed peas are also associated with virulent racism in the United States. Sadly, Harris uses memoirs and significant events as written by characters to tell the stories. Sometimes as I read it, I cringed. Other times I had an aha moment, and in every chapter I learned something. Like during the horrors of the Middle Passage, when hundreds of slaves were shackled together at the bottom of the ship, the visuals were so horrifying, as always, and we've all seen them at some point or the other. Harris wants to know how they were fed and what did they eat. And I found that to be very interesting because it was certainly not something that I had considered before. And so in this chapter, she explores how they were fed and what they were, how they were fed and what they ate. She talks about the cooks on board the ships, and she talks about how dicey that was for some of the ship's captains. Explorers, travelers to Africa as early as the 1300s introduced new food, new cooking methods, utensils, imported new cultural influences. She describes how religion had influence on the African culture. Religions such as Islam, when introduced to the African culture, also introduced new dietary habits, as did Christianity. The Catholics, when they introduced Christianity to the African continent, also introduced new rituals and new eating habits. These imports began to influence cuisine early on, even before the transatlantic slave trade moved millions of Africans from different parts of Africa based on food. Harris refers to the crucibles of rice, cereal, and yams that influenced the slave trade. They mark the distinct areas from which enslaved Africans were brought to the United States and the areas to which they were taken. Each had its own preference. Those from the rice crucible were among the earliest transported by the transatlantic slave trade. They brought with them their knowledge of rice cultivation and their memories of rice-based cuisine. Those from the yam crucible arrived later as the voracious slave trade picked up and made its way down the West African coast from Senegal to the Gold Coast and beyond. And those from the cereal crucible were inland and therefore not an immediate influence on American taste until the inception of the slave trade. Of course, the most significant event was the transatlantic slave trade. And virtually all nations of Europe participated in this trade and shipped millions of slaves at all times of the year. And each of these nations brought its own cuisine and tastes that later influenced and were influenced by American cuisine. For example, she tells the story of an African slave who worked for a Dutchman in New York, learning how to make donuts. She talks about the Portuguese influence, the French influence, and the Spanish influence. Other events included, significant events included the period before, during, and after the emancipation, and of course the short-lived Reconstruction, and how that influenced the movement of formerly enslaved people, particularly those who moved west. She related the story of the third annual convention for the improvement of free people of color in 1883, when this group decided to migrate to Texas to escape the horrors after Reconstruction. They wanted to go to Texas because they couldn't go to Africa, and Texas was at that time not a part of the United States. Unfortunately for them, though, Texas became a state shortly in 3 years later, and that took care of that initiative. But many went west anyway, and later followed the gold rush in hopes of finding ways to use the skilled trades that they had learned. Enter the Black cowboy and their unique chuck wagon cuisine. And so she discusses the Black cowboy. And I found that particularly interesting because we don't hear much, or we haven't learned much in the past about Black cowboys. That's also explored beautifully in the Netflix series. In between all of that, in between or along with all of these great other events were wars, the Great Depression, and other historic events that influenced how all Americans lived, how they survived, and ultimately how they thrived, how they put food on the table and what food they put on the table. The civil rights movement and the emergence of the Black middle class and upper class were influential. Think about the impact of food in political activism, such as the use of lunch counters as a means of protest. The other way that Harris tells the story is through participants. She calls what I would have called a character, she calls a participant. These are the people, really the most interesting aspects of the book for me. Now, I have to go ahead and remind you that I am probably not pronouncing these names correctly, but that is, you should take as encouragement to either listen to her narrative, or if you're good at French, then you'll be better at pronouncing it than I am. But in every chapter, she introduces some participant, some character that helps to balance out the hard parts, that brings, that you learn a little bit about the hard part, but then she brings in the joy. And so she weaves the story in each chapter through actual people that whose existence she could document. So Oluda Equiano is the first named person to set foot in America, who wrote and self-published an autobiography titled The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Oluda Equiano. His portrait hangs in the Royal Albert Memorial Museum. You will want to learn more about him. Esteban Dorantes, a slave to a Spaniard, who was the first to step foot ashore on the North American continent. He was owned by a hapless explorer who stumbled into all sorts of problems. Esteban was enslaved along with his hapless master briefly by the indigenous Native Americans, and ended up walking 8 years to get from Texas to New Mexico. This 1542 story is detailed in a report called La Relation. And along the way, he learned some things from the Native Americans about planting, harvesting, and cooking. That's a most interesting story in this book. And then she talks about the founding slaves, most notably Hercules, who worked in George Washington's kitchen at Mount Vernon and in New York. His cooking was legendary, and Washington moved him to New York when he didn't like the food in the place where he was staying. I'll tell you a little bit about Hercules in Harris's own words. Hercules was a big house cook at Mount Vernon. He's described as a celebrated artiste and an accomplished master of the culinary arts by his contemporaries. He had begun his life in the kitchen at Mount Vernon, probably as a member of the house servants family. He worked his way up in the pecking order, and it is known that he was named chief cook at Mount Vernon by 1786. Hercules was brought to New York when his master, George Washington, was displeased with the presidential fare there. And in 1790, when the capital moved to Philadelphia, Hercules moved there with Washington as well. His duties extended beyond simply cooking. He also oversaw the smooth running of Washington's kitchens, which at one point contained a German cook and 2 French cooks. He was charged not only with overseeing all family meals from the preparation to the service, but also with personally preparing more formal Thursday dinners and congressional repasts. The food was closer to that of Britain, but meals were served in the tradition of the French service. So there were multiple courses, and at the conclusion of the first course, the dishes in the napery were removed, revealing new tableware underneath, which was then set for the second course, usually a dessert course of cakes, cookies, pies, and jellies in vast array. House slaves in service at the table would place platters on it, bring fresh glasses and dishes as required, and serve drinks and additional dishes that were displayed on the sideboard. At extremely formal occasions, the second tablecloth would be removed to reveal the mahogany table underneath, which had preserved fruits and nuts that would be served along with beverages. And this was dinner. Supper came later. So Hercules was pretty adept in this skilled trade. But although he was enslaved, he, like many free chefs of the period, enjoyed some other opportunities. He was able, because he had some privileges, he could earn a little bit of money from leftovers. And with that money, he would buy some nice clothes and step out. So he was known as a dandy. But Hercules wanted to be free. And so he eventually planned his escape and got away from his master, George Washington. Now, George Washington was offended by that and wrote that the running off of my cook has been a most inconvenient thing to this family. But he spared no expense in trying to find him and bring him back. And Hercules knew that if he were brought back, his life would be miserable. Another presidential cook or chef was named James Hemings. Not much was known about James Hemings at first, but from this book, actually, I learned that he was Sally Hemings' brother. And he was one that Thomas Jefferson took under his wing, took him to Paris, where he learned the culinary arts from the French back in 1784. He studied with bakers and others, and he brought these culinary, he brought this back to the United States and taught the people in Virginia, introduced this to folks in Virginia. So he introduced macaroni and cheese And so we're very pleased about that. So James Heming, and there were others. Samuel Fuentes, who had a tavern named after him right after the War of Independence. Robert Bogle in Philadelphia, who was the first public butler and became a caterer. Mary Ellen Pleasant, who passed for white in Gold Rush, California, and transformed her culinary and domestic skills into great personal wealth. Pigfoot Mary, a migrant street vendor who moved from Mississippi and sold pig feet, chicken, and hot corn on the streets of New York. George Pullman, who introduced the Pullman car. All influenced or were influenced by their experiences, and they impacted African-American cuisine. In the end, Harris wants the reader to understand that African-American cuisine has turned a corner, just as African-Americans have turned a corner. African-Americans should no longer be identified as those who have unsophisticated palates. Thank you. And so let me just close by telling you what it means to live high on the hog. Stephen Satterfield says that if you've ever lived in a household where chitlins were cooked and that smell of chitlins permeated the whole household, you knew the difference between chitlins and a pork chop. Harris says that this book is at the same time a first and a last, as its writing has led her on an odyssey, as well as open doors in her life. She's attempting to journey from the back of the ham and take her own life higher on the hog. And I can't let you go without telling you the story of Old Master. Old Master killed about 40 or 50 hogs every year. He had John to help him. When he was ready to pay him off, he said, "John, here's your pig head and pig feet and pig ears." John said, "Thank you, boss." So John killed the hogs for about 5 years that way. That's what he got for his pay. Then John moved on back of the place and got himself 3 hogs. Old Master didn't even know he had a hog. Next winter at hog killing time, Old Master went down after John. And Old Master says, "John." John comes to the door, "Yes, sir." Old Master says, "Be down at the house early in the morning. I want to kill hogs. Be there about 5:30. John asked, "Well, Old Master, what you paying?" "I'll pay you like I always did. I'll give you the head and all the ears and all the pig feet and all the tails." John said, "Well, Old Master, I can't, because I'm eating higher on the hog than that now. I got 3 hogs of my own, and I eat spare ribs, backbone, pork chops, middling, ham, and everything else. I eat high on the hog now." There's so much more I could tell you about this book. I encourage you to read it. I encourage you to watch the Netflix series. And that's my presentation.
Great, thank you, Marilyn. Thoroughly enjoyed it. We can open it up to some questions, folks. You can either ask questions through the chat, and the chat icon is at the bottom of the screen, and you can just click on that and write your question, and we'll read that. Or you might even be able to speak live as well. So just unmute yourself, and you can ask live, and you can see how that goes. So let's see what we have here. You're getting a lot of kudos, Marilyn. So that's good.
Thank you.
One question that came up was, are you related in some way to the author?
I don't know, but I don't think so. And if I were, it would be through marriage. So that would be kind of a bummer. But as far as I know, we're not related.
Have you been down to the Gray yourself?
I have. As a matter of fact, this holiday at Thanksgiving, I invited my family to read High on the Hog. And then when they came here, I wanted to be certain that they experienced everything that was covered in this book. So we had Low Country Boil, We visited Gullah Grub and Marshview Farms, and then we went to the Gray and enjoyed the cuisine there. So I encourage other people to do the same thing.
Yeah, I would do that also. It's a great restaurant, and I got a
Yes.
chance to meet Mashama Bailey, so
I did too, and I have a picture.
quite the lady. So quite the lady.
Quite the lady.
Let's see if there's any other questions here. Is the Gray the former Savannah bus station that was renovated by in Savannah? And that answer is yes, former Greyhound bus station. That was renovated. Everybody's thanking you, Marilyn. Let's see.
Marilyn, are you a good cook?
No. I don't know. It depends on who you ask. If you ask me, I would say not in the tradition that Jessica B. Harris writes about. As a matter of fact, our family didn't do the big Sunday dinners and the way that she describes many Southern African-American families. We ate similar foods, but we didn't gather that way. But I love that we do down here. And so I'm always looking for someplace to have dinner on Sunday.
Does anybody have any other questions? Any
Thanks,
comments?
Denise.
That was fabulous.
Was it fun?
Awesome. There's the real Barbara.
A lot of good comments, Marilyn. So people really want to enjoy the book. I think you inspired a lot of people to do that.
It's an awesome book, and I think that you would enjoy reading it. You would enjoy listening to it. And I do encourage you, if you are going to do the Netflix series, I really think you should read the book first, because even the producers of Netflix says it's so much that they couldn't cover it all. So do both if you can.
So much fun.
7 years.
Marilyn, how do I know Marilyn? Oh, how do I know Marilyn? How do I know Jessica? Marilyn?
Marilyn, someone is asking how long you've been in Beaufort.
7 years, almost 7 years.
And did you just find your way off the highway like everyone else does?
Yes, that's a great way to describe it. I'm on a spiritual journey. Not necessarily culinary, although now I think I will.
It sounds like they're intertwined.
I believe you're right.
Yeah, one of the comments, Marilyn, was that it was interesting the way the food is woven into the historical context of the period. And I found that pretty interesting too. I didn't read the book completely, but I read excerpts, and it certainly piqued my interest too to continue with that.
Hi, excuse me, this is Susie McMahon, and I was just wondering if Marilyn could recommend some other authentic restaurant locations on St. Helena or the Beaufort area besides the ones you've already mentioned.
Well, I probably would defer to my friend Victoria for that, but the Gullah Grub here on St. Helena is very authentic. Would you agree, Victoria?
I do agree with that. Thank you. The Gullah Grub is going to be owned by Chef Bill Green, and then you also have his wife, Sarah Reynolds Green, and she has the Marshview Organic Farms on St. Helena Island, and you can count on receiving those field to table collard greens, okra, tomatoes, yams, or as Jessica B. Harris has recorrected us, that is, we are not eating yams right now, we're eating sweet potatoes.
That's right.
And traditionally the yams are coming, much larger. We know now, I know now, but because I'm Gullah, we've always called it yams. And it comes generationally from my ancestors on down to us. So the Gullah Grub is one, of course, the Gray is another. And then also, there's so many in Charleston, but you're talking about right here in our beautiful Beaufort area. And actually, there's some restaurants that have some really great Gullah cuisine that you may not realize is actually Gullah. So when you go to your local restaurant, maybe like Ren or someplace like that, or others, there's so many that are here, you can ask them, you know, what is something on your menu that is of Gullah cuisine? And that might be shrimp and grits. That might be, you know, of course, we already know the Low Country boil or frogmore stew, as some people call it. But it goes on and on. You can even think about bringing in some Jamaican cuisine. There, we do have a Jamaican restaurant here that brings in that African diaspora connection. And when I took a trip to Sierra Leone 2 years ago, you could see the very, very similar styles of food: fish, cabbage and carrots shredded and steamed. And then you have the plantain, or you have pineapple and papaya on the side. And of course, rice. The reason why Gullah Geechee people are here in the United States. I turn it back over.
Someone mentioned McKinnon's on Ladies Island, and I would say that is a great option for honest to goodness, down home, country, African-American food.
Somebody was asking about Charleston restaurants.
I'm not familiar with those, sorry.
Victoria, anything jump out at you? Maybe
Well, there's too many.
just one or two that might, you know,
Just
notable.
one or two. Wow, I nothing is jumping out at the moment, and you have to forgive me, but there's My Three Sons. That's one in the North Charleston area. My Three
Okay.
Sons.
Mhm.
And then there's also Nigel's, which is Gullah cuisine. My Three Sons, all by Gullah Geechee natives of Charleston. Those are going to be in North Charleston, so not in downtown. They would love to be able to get into a downtown area.
Mhm. The question that did come up was, does Gullah shrimp and grits contain sausage?
It depends on the chef or the person who's cooking it, and if there's some leftovers from breakfast or the day before. It really is just the chef's preference. I typically do not see, when we cook, I do not see the sausage in it. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
My stomach is grumbling. Did you hear that rumble? It was very loud.
Good, then I was successful.
I know everybody's getting hungry. Hey, well, I think we could take one more question, and if anybody has one more question, Marilyn, we'd be glad to answer that. If not, Marilyn, I just want to thank you on behalf of Book Sandwich Inn for the presentation. Everyone enjoyed it. I certainly did. And again, we hope to see it one of our other presentations, but thank you very much, and good talking with you today.
Thank you.
For everybody else out there, we'll see you next week on February 7th. And remember that we had some substitutions, and next week would be The Sudden Caregiver, a roadmap for resilient caregiving, and that'll be presented by Karen Warner Schuler, who is one of our Book Sandwich Inn co-chairs. So with that being said, have a great day today. Enjoy this beautiful weather. It's supposed to be a great week, and we'll see you next week. Take care.